We're beautiful like diamonds in the sky.
Hey everybody, Dr. Silvermintz back with another Spotlight lecture in the history of ethics. We're continuing our discussion of Meno, and let's take a moment to think back and to review the first half of the Meno. Meno, in fact, initiates the whole discussion with Socrates. He begins the discussion by provoking Socrates. Tell me, Socrates, can virtue be taught? And Socrates flips the script on Meno by insisting that we have to know first what virtue is before we know how we can acquire it. And Meno responds by saying it's not a hard question to answer. And in the first part of the dialogue, he gives us 3 attempts at defining virtue. His first one comes at 71e. This one, Meno gives us a plurality of definitions. He says, for a man, a virtue is being able to manage the affairs of one's house as well as the affairs of state, to be involved in politics, to go to war when your country calls on you. And likewise, there's a virtue for a woman to manage the house, and a virtue for a slave, and a virtue for an old man, and a virtue for a young man, so on and so forth. There's a different virtue for these different classifications of people, because Meno thinks that people slot into these different categories. Socrates doesn't like that. He challenges Meno, but aren't we all the same? And if we are all human beings, shouldn't there be one kind of virtue that applies to all of us equally? And Meno amends that first definition to suggest at 73b that virtue is ruling over other people, because just as the man rules over the city, Meno says that the woman rules over her household. And so both men and women, while they're ruling over different domains, are both rulers over their respective domain. And this is Meno's second attempt at defining virtue. But Socrates again challenges him, because we know all rulers are not virtuous rulers. There are plenty of examples from history of ruthless tyrants. And Meno tries again at 77b and says that virtue is acquiring and desiring the beautiful things and having the ability to obtain these things. And again, Socrates challenges him. When you are suggesting the beautiful things, don't you really mean the good things? And so many people are mistaken. They pursue what they think is beautiful, but they're looking for love in the wrong places, and they end up doing themselves in. And so Meno attempts 3 times to define virtue. Each of the 3 times are challenged by Socrates. They're insufficient definitions. And at this point, at 80a, Meno loses his cool and he makes an attack on Socrates. He offers what's known in logic as an ad hominem attack and challenges Socrates. He says, Socrates, you are ugly. You're ugly like a torpedo fish. And Socrates was very famously known for his ugly appearance. The Greeks were known and had admired good looks in the sculpted body, but Socrates had a huge bulbous nose and a big flat face. And so Meno says, you're as ugly as the torpedo fish. You with your flat, big, bulging nose are an ugly man. This is an ad hominem argument, because an ad hominem argument attacks the person rather than the argument. Meno's losing the argument, and we all know how that works. Sometimes when you're debating an issue with your friend and your friend has more facts on their side and more logic on their side, and you're frustrated, all of a sudden you start saying, where'd you get that sweater from? You've lost the argument, you've lost control, and so you take a cheap shot at your friend's looks, at their appearance, at what they're wearing, rather than the logic and the saliency of their argument. But then Meno follows it up with a very serious argument. He says, you, Socrates, have perplexed me. You bewitched me. I came here knowing what virtue is. And in fact, Meno gave us 3 definitions of virtue. And now he says, I'm completely confused. But here's the problem. If you, Socrates, said at the very beginning, which Socrates said, I don't know what virtue is. I don't myself have a good definition. And now we keep searching, and I've given these definitions, and each one you say is wrong. How will we ever know if one of these definitions that we were considering was the right one, if we began from a position of ignorance? Let's illustrate that. If we say, go find the widget and bring it back to us, and we have no clue what the person means when they say the widget, they've really sent us on a wild goose chase. We could be picking up the exact item they're referring to, but since we at the outset didn't know what a widget was, we wouldn't know that we had found exactly what we were searching for. This is known as the paradox of inquiry. And so Meno's initial attack on Socrates, calling him the fish and that he's ugly, that's a cheap shot. His paradox regarding the impossibility of inquiry is a very serious argument in the history of logic and philosophy. That learning is impossible since we begin from a position of ignorance. All of us come to school to learn, and we begin from a position of ignorance, right? We have to admit that. And so how will we ever be able to know that we found the right answers if we're beginning from that position of ignorance, right? That's a serious problem. And what's really going on here is Meno was all excited to start this discussion with Socrates. He initiated the whole thing. He wanted to learn from Socrates. He wanted Socrates to give him the answer. But when Socrates flips the script on him and is pressing Meno to do the hard work and the learning and to think out his ideas and to reason out his answers, Meno gets very frustrated. Particularly, Meno feels like his belief system is under attack. When Socrates suggests that desiring the beautiful things may not be the good things, maybe Meno's strategy for winning the game of life has been completely mistaken. Maybe he's looking for love in all the wrong places. And Meno's shocked and offended and wants to end the whole discussion. At this point, Socrates, who we might acknowledge as one of the earliest, if not the first psychologists, the first one to seriously study human behavior, and Socrates really had a very keen understanding of other people's weaknesses and their shortcomings and their proclivities and their inclinations and their desires. And he was able to read people's minds and souls and hearts to see how they might be misguided. And he's very concerned for Meno's mental health. And Meno wants to end the discussion at ADA. He makes that attack on Socrates. He puts an attempt at ending the whole inquiry by suggesting the paradox of inquiry. And Socrates responds with a bit of medicine to try to keep Meno in the game. He needs to take something out of his toolbox sometimes when the patient is so disturbed and so up in arms that we need some sort of technique and approach to take out of the medicine chest to calm somebody who's in such an agitated state as Meno is at ADA, to attack Socrates when he initially came to Socrates for help and assistance. And so Socrates says, young man, Meno, there's a story I once heard. I heard it from the priest and priestesses. So we should already be on alert that here Socrates, who's such a famous individual and person in the history of philosophy for rational thought, is appealing at this moment to stories from the priest, to the supernatural realm. And the story that he tells Meno is that this is not the only life we've led. It's a story we've heard before, that we've been reincarnated from a previous life.
The city-state of Athens has adopted a polytheistic religion, which means that people feared, worshipped, and made offerings to many different gods: Zeus, Poseidon, Athena, etc. The ancient Greeks also believed that upon death, the soul would leave the body and travel to the underworld, remaining there forever as mere shadows guarded by Hades, the god of the underworld. But there were also obscure groups of people who believed differently in regards to the soul. They believed in metempsychosis, or the transmigration of the soul. In this view, the soul will depart the body at death and re-enter another body in a perpetual cycle. These small pockets of people were the Pythagoreans, those who followed the teachings of the Greek philosopher Pythagoras, and the Orphics, the adherents of a religion based on the mythical poet Orpheus.
We're going to have to see how Socrates is using this story, again, as a certain medicine for Meno. Initially, he wants to scare Meno. Perhaps Meno's strategy for winning the game of life is very misguided. Perhaps Meno's on a road to ruin, as we learn from Xenophon's account of his misdeeds, of his use of deceit and wicked ways. And so perhaps initially Socrates wants to scare him. If this is not the only life, and that our actions in this life have consequences for the next life, perhaps Meno might reconsider his actions. So first, the story has a bit of an ethical overtone. But then Socrates applies this idea of reincarnation to address Minos Paradox. What's Minos Paradox? That learning is impossible since we begin from a position of ignorance. But Socrates suggests that we are not beginning from complete ignorance. Since we lived previous lives, again, according to the myth of recollection, if in a previous life we were a mathematician, and a physicist, and an engineer, and a construction builder, and a musician, if we've had all of these different lives and all of these different careers, then learning is not learning for the first time, but rather learning is a kind of recollection. And we're just jarring our memory. We know when meet somebody that we've met before and we can't remember their name, we play that name game when we try to jar our memory, and we go through the alphabet with Amy, Allison, Andrew, Beth, Bethany. Oh, that's it, Bethany. Right? So we know that we've met that person before. It's just not on the tip of our tongue. And so we have to jar our memory to bring it back up to the front of our consciousness. And so Socrates is suggesting, if in fact this story is true, then learning is this process of remembering. And if in fact, if we buy into that story, then we have addressed Minos Paradox, but even bigger. Look at the possibilities that we can learn anything in a very simple way, because all we need to do is jar our memory. The problem is, do we believe that story? I mean, who today believes that story?
In hopes of an out-of-this-world experience.
The next step is we're going to bring the lights down.
At up to $139 a ticket, they seemed confident that through hypnosis they could uncover lost memories, not just of this life, but of past lives as well.
Be there, back there, before your birth.
Call them come-as-you-were events, reincarnation conventions. No longer considered completely off the wall, they are growing in popularity.
You can remember everything.
I had an experience that I was on the Titanic.
I regress back to, I want to say, the mid-1800s in England.
Of course, when everybody has thoughts that they had a previous life, they were doing something grand in the previous life. They were a prince, they were a princess in a castle, right? So these are very nice that people want to believe they had a previous life. And it's also nice that somebody's charging them a lot of money to bring those past life regressions to consciousness. But again, you may be thinking, what a scam. And in fact, Socrates doesn't want us to just believe this myth. He's going to prove it to Meno with absolute certainty. And so Socrates now sets up a scientific experiment to try to prove this story. Again, some of you may be skeptical at this point and think, I don't believe that. But here, Socrates now is going to use a human experiment to prove that, in fact, we all have had a previous life. And he's going to do it by asking Meno's slave, who's obviously never had any formal education, certainly not the 12 to 15 years of math education that we've all had to solve a very complicated math problem. And if Meno's slave, who's had no formal education, could solve a complicated math problem, where did he get this knowledge from?
Socrates, Plato's teacher and the central figure in his dialogues, wants to demonstrate to his friend Meno that knowledge of geometric truths is innate. How will he do this? By drawing a subtle geometric proof out of the mind of a slave boy who has had no training in geometry. Socrates will put no thoughts into the boy's head. He will only ask questions that help the boy to clarify his own innate ideas.
If the slave who's had no formal education solves the math problem, let's see if all of us could solve the math problem. The problem is this. If we start with a square that is 2 feet by 2 feet, and of course the area of that square would be what?
4.
4. Okay, 4. So now that's the setup. And the question that Socrates poses is, how long should the side of a square be to double the area? So we want to double the area of that initial square. That initial square had an area of 4. That part's simple. Now, how do we double the area of that square? How long should the side of a square be to create a double square? What do you think? How long should it be?
4. Double it. 4.
4. Okay, so why 4?
Because if we just double the sides, it'll double the area, right?
Oh, okay. So, and in fact, that was the direction the slave went in as well. If we double the length of the side of the square, perhaps that'll give us a double square. But if we have a 4 by 4 square, what's the area of a 4 by 4 square?
16.
16, right? So we wanted a square with area of 8 of a double square. Instead, we got a square with area of 16. We got a quadruple square, way off the mark. Even though there was a certain rationale for doubling the size, we ended up with a quadruple square. And in math class, what would we grade that answer? It's wrong. It gets an F, even though it had a certain rationale. Okay, so the 4 by 4 was way off the mark. Let's try it again.
All right. 4 is too big, so 3, I guess.
Okay, and so the 4 was way off the mark. So again, that makes sense. We didn't go bigger. We didn't go about 5 by 5. Let's try a 3 by 3. And of course, the area of a 3 by 3 square is what?
Oh, 9.
9. So again, we wanted a square of 8. Should we give that answer credit for being better since we got closer to 8 than the 4 by 4 square? No, it's just as wrong, right? In brain surgery, do we want a brain surgeon who gets close to the tumor they're cutting out? They got close to it. They got closer on the next surgery. No, we want the brain surgeon to be so tactical and strategic that they exactly cut out the tumor and none of the healthy tissue. Right? They cut out any of the healthy tissue, they could damage our language ability, they could damage our motor coordination, they could damage some other important function of the brain. We want the brain surgeon to be precise, and close doesn't cut it. And the same is true in math. All the sciences are modeled on math because math gives us that absolute precision. An answer is either right or wrong. So let's try again. If 4 was too big and 3 was too big, let's try it again.
I'm not a calculator. I can't do that.
Okay, and the reason that we're not going to guess again, 4 was a guess, 3 was a guess. Why not guess again? Well, we all know there is some answer to this, but how well does guessing work in math? Right? There is an answer, and when we say we don't know, that's exactly what the slave said at 84B. And in fact, that's one of the most important moments of the whole dialogue. The slave acknowledges that he doesn't know the answer. And when he says he doesn't know the answer, which reminds us very early on, at the very beginning of the whole dialogue, Socrates said he didn't know what virtue is. And then Meno at 88 again said, I'm confused now, Socrates, I'm perplexed. So this is the third time someone in the dialogue is saying, I don't know. When the slave says he doesn't know, it's an important moment. It's a breakthrough moment in the slave figuring out what he does know and then getting to the solution. First of all, let's start with what he does know. The first thing he knows is that guessing isn't a way to solve a math problem. He could continue to guess, right? We know now that the answer is somewhere between 2 and 3. 2 point something times 2 point something is 8, right? The answer is the square root of 8, but that's an irrational number. It's not something that we can throw out as like a whole number. It's a complicated thing that the ancient Greeks couldn't have computed the square root of 8. And yet, knowing that the answer is 2 point something times 2 point something, the slave stopped guessing. Why is that? Because how many numbers are between 2 and 3, right? There's 2.1, 2.11, 2.111. I won't keep going. There's an infinite number of numbers between 2 and 3. How many of those are the correct answer to our problem? 1, which makes the chances of guessing 1 over infinity. That's a lot worse than Powerball. Don't play that game. The slave realized he knows the limits of the answer. It's somewhere between 2 and 3. He knows there is an answer, but he's learned from this quick exercise that guessing is not the way to get to the answer. Okay, at this point, Socrates slightly helps the boy, but Socrates is very clear throughout the whole thing. He says, I'm not teaching him. I'm just asking him questions. And in fact, that's very obvious because the slave has just given us 2 incorrect answers. So Socrates is certainly not putting the answer into his head. The slave is showing his original thinking, his ability to think through and to try and to put himself out there, and he gives us incorrect answers, then realizes the errors of his way. He tries to correct his answers, and now his big breakthrough moment in saying he doesn't know. And at this point, we should all be trying to solve the problem, but again, we need to have the humility to not just make another guess. We need a different approach to solve the problem. And here's where Socrates helps him by showing him the diagonal. If we take the diagonal of that initial square and bisect that square into 2 triangles, each of those triangles gives us an area of what?
2.
Of 2. And we want a square with area of 8. So how might we get to our square with area of 8 if we take that triangle and combine it with?
Well, that one's 2, and that one's 2, and that one's 2, and that one's 2. Then this diamond gives us 8.
So we've got our double square, 2, 4, 6, 8. Who do we appreciate? We've got our double square. And the problem was, why didn't we see that the diamond was the double square? Why didn't we see that the diamond was shining bright and looking out at us as the solution to our problem? Because we were looking in the wrong place. We were looking for love in the wrong. Since we were looking and expecting the double square to be positioned in the way that we're used to, we weren't expecting to find the solution to the problem in the way that the diamond presented itself. If we're standing on our head, then the world looks upside down. Then fast food looks like nourishment. And we don't realize that healthy food is really what's good for us, right? If we're not standing in the right position, then the wrong answers might seem right to us, and the right answers seem wrong. This diagram is a very powerful answer to the whole problem that Meno positions to Socrates. How do we acquire virtue? Well, Meno had said that virtue was impossible. But what did we see? Well, Socrates had said that this experiment with the slave was going to prove that we've all lived a previous life. Is that really what the exercise proved? Is that how we solve a math problem? Because we lived a previous life, and in a previous life I was Pythagoras and I was a great mathematician? No. We solved the problem because we all have a mind that's able to think logically. We are hardwired to think logically and rationally. And this, by the way, refutes Meno's earlier notion that people are fundamentally different, that some people are meant to be masters and some to be slaves, that we fit into different categories. Here we see even somebody with no formal education can think through a fairly complicated math problem. In fact, Meno's slave seems to show greater rationality and reasoning ability than Meno himself. We all can think rationally, and I offer to you, if we were all put in separate rooms and were given this problem, even those of us that have math anxiety, we would all ultimately solve the problem. And what's fascinating is when we solved the problem and found our way to the diamond, ultimately, we would all come to the same answer, even though we weren't talking to each other. How is it that we all come to the same answer? That's because math taps into a realm of absolute truth. So we began our whole discussion of ethics with the question, are ethics a subject that has absolute answers, or do we all have different answers? Are we all so different that moral and ethical questions are different for each person in each time period, in each place around the world? That's of the fundamental dispute. And the sophists want to argue that we're all fundamentally different. Protagoras' argument that the human being is the measure, and we all have different feelings and emotions and opinions. And since we all have different feelings and emotions, one person's right is another person's wrong. One person's trash is another person's treasure. One person's immorality is another person's morality. But Socrates challenges that view. He radically disagrees with the sophists and shows us in this, what seems like a digression. Here we were talking about ethics, the whole dialogue, and all of a sudden we slipped into a math problem. Why is Socrates showing us a math problem? Because he's showing us that, at least in the case of math class, there are absolutely right answers and there are wrong answers. And we're not afraid to get judgy in math class and say, that 4x4 answer, even though you showed rationality and logic, it's still wrong. And the 3x3 answer, you might think, but it's closer. But closer doesn't cut it in math. It's still wrong. We want the answer that computes and is absolutely right. Because when we do that, we tap into something universal and eternal. We tap into a truth that was, is, and will always be. What, in fact, the slave proved by solving the problem. When the slave found the way to the diamond, the slave showed an important proof for the Pythagorean theorem, that the square of one side of that original 2x2 square plus the square of another side of the 2x2 square equals c squared, or the diagonal squared as the diamond. That's the Pythagorean theorem. And Pythagoras didn't create the theorem. He discovered what was, is, and will always be the truth of the Pythagorean theorem that a squared plus b squared equals c squared for a right triangle was, is, and will always be. And Socrates is using that to get Meno to think ethics is just as absolute. What is true for one is true for all, and we should think of all people as possessing the same virtue. And perhaps when it comes to particular questions of right and wrong, we're in the position that we were when we were unclear of the solution to the problem, but we knew there was a solution to the problem. That's what Socrates' general dictum is. I know that I don't know. I don't know all the answers, but I believe that there are answers. Life then is like an unsolved math problem, right? The ultimate answers to all of the specific ethical questions, Socrates hasn't worked out yet. We're in a position very similar when we knew that there was a solution and it was 2 point something. That's how we are with a lot of ethical questions. There is an answer. There is some right and there is some wrong, but maybe we haven't found the answer yet. This leads Socrates to suggest if we're lacking knowledge and we still have to live our lives, what do we do? Well, number one, if we guess our way to answers, we could be in a lot of trouble. That's another thing we've learned from the math exercise. The slave guessed at his first answer, and he showed some. It was a logical guess. It was, but his guess of the 4x4 was way off the mark. He eyeballs it, and eyeballing things and guessing at what could be the right direction to go in life could be our road to ruin. Right? We guess at what's healthy for us or what people are good for us, and we could be making tragic mistakes. We don't want to risk our lives with a guess. So although people have anxiety about math class, we should have the same anxiety about life. We should take life just as seriously, that a wrong answer could get us into a lot of trouble. And we should seek for those kind of absolute answers. Just as the brain surgeon wants to find exactly where the tumor, we want to be just as strategic. So we want to seek for knowledge. Socrates tells us in 88e that the soul will be directed to achieve success in all things in life when it is directed by knowledge and wisdom rather than folly and ignorance. That's great. When we have knowledge, we will always get the right answer. Now that we know how to solve this problem, give us a square of any length and we can immediately solve the problem. But when we're lacking knowledge, what should we do? And there Socrates gives us the second best. At 97, he says, if you need to find your way, Socrates says, your way from here to Larissa, and that's the city that Minos from. If you're trying to find directions somewhere, it will work equally well if you get directions from somebody who knows the way, from the GPS system that knows the way, or somebody who's just taking a guess. I don't know. That looks like the way. If you follow either the person with knowledge or you follow somebody who ends up having the right opinion and it gets you where you want to go, that's great. Because the real goal is success, is getting where you want to go. The trouble, the difficulty, of course, is if the person just guessed. As we saw with the math problem, guessing is a dangerous and murky area. Sometimes we have to guess in life because we have to act, and the moment can't wait for us to get knowledge. And if guessing gets us where we want to go, that's great. But then at 98a, Socrates says the problem with a good opinion, a true opinion, is it flies out of our soul unless it's tied down. So true opinions are a stopgap. They're what we have to do in an emergency situation when we have to act. But we need to secure those true opinions. We need to ground them. We need to tie them down so that we won't flip-flop and switch a true opinion, because when we're in the realm of an opinion, and what's the difference between an opinion and knowledge? Socrates says that 98b, one thing I know for certain. Socrates is very famous for saying, I know that I don't know. But at 98b, he says, one thing I know for certain is there is a difference between knowledge and opinion. We loosely say we know things. But at 98a, Socrates is very clear that knowledge is when we've tied something down, when we've proven why something is true. And when we have the proof, when you don't just memorize a squared plus b squared equals c squared, when you don't just memorize the formula, but you understand the proof, you understand why something is true, then you will always do the right thing. Socrates says, you know the good, you will always do the good, and you will achieve success in life. Meno keeps pushing him, but how can I learn? How can I be taught this? But what did we learn in the exercise with the slave? We really don't need teachers. The slave was just asked questions. All Socrates did was ask questions, and Socrates is similarly asking questions of Meno. He keeps provoking Meno with metaphors and images and challenging him to think. And likewise, we're challenged by Socrates to be more like the slave than Meno, to be more like the slave when the slave has the humility to say, first, I don't know. And that humility of saying, I don't know, is the breakthrough moment to put the slave on the path to getting the solution. So we should all acknowledge first that we don't know so that we can seek grounded answers that we can back up with proven knowledge. We'll see everybody back soon in our next Spotlight lecture.